The morning frost clung to the windowpanes of the Whitmore cottage like delicate lace, and Constance pressed her palm against the cold glass as she watched the Hendersons' wagon lumber past their front gate. Inside the wagon bed, little Mary Henderson lay wrapped in quilts, her fevered face pale as winter wheat. The child had been burning with sickness for 3 days now, and her mother's tears had carved fresh lines down her weathered cheeks. "Prudence," Constance called softly, never taking her eyes from the struggling family. "Fetch the good china and that jar of beef broth from the cellar. The Hendersons will need sustenance." Her younger sister appeared in the doorway, flour dusting her apron and her graying hair pulled back in its customary tight bun. Prudence Whitmore had always been the quieter of the two, content to let Constance handle the talking while she worked her magic in the kitchen. "The broth with the herbs, sister." "Yes, the one that helped old Samuel Morrison through his lung fever last month." Constance turned from the window, her kind eyes reflecting genuine concern. "And perhaps some of that tender stew meat we prepared yesterday. The child needs strength." Within the hour, the sisters were walking the muddy path to the Henderson homestead, their arms laden with covered dishes that steamed in the cold February air. Millbrook, Virginia was not a town that could afford to let its people suffer alone. With only 43 families scattered across the rolling hills and dense forests, every soul mattered, every life was precious. The harsh winter of 1841 had already claimed 2 elderly residents, and the failed harvest meant that charity was not just Christian duty, it was survival. "Miss Constance, Miss Prudence," Martha Henderson sobbed as she opened her cabin door. "I don't know how to thank you. We've nothing left to trade, nothing to offer in return." Constance set down her burden and took the younger woman's work-roughened hands in her own. "Nonsense, dear. We are all part of God's family here in Millbrook. Your recovery is payment enough." Inside the one-room cabin, little Mary's labored breathing filled the silence. Prudence knelt beside the child's bed and spooned the warm broth between her cracked lips with the patience of a saint. The rich, savory liquid seemed to bring color back to the girl's cheeks almost immediately. "What's in this broth?" Martha whispered, watching her daughter's eyelids flutter with the first peaceful sleep she'd had in days. "It smells like nothing I've ever made." Prudence glanced at her sister before answering. "Old family recipe. My grandmother passed it down. The secret is in the long, slow cooking." By evening, word had spread through Millbrook about the Whitmore sisters' latest act of kindness. It was always the same, wherever illness, misfortune, or hunger threatened, Constance and Prudence appeared like earthly angels, their baskets filled with the most nourishing meals anyone had ever tasted. Their generosity had become legendary in the small community, spoken of in the same reverent tones reserved for biblical miracles. "Those women are saints," Thomas Aldrich heard Mrs. Crawford tell her husband as he passed their porch that evening. The newly appointed sheriff had only been in Millbrook for 2 weeks, but he'd already heard the Whitmore name mentioned with almost religious devotion. "Saints indeed," Abraham Crawford agreed, rocking slowly in his chair. "Remember when the Miller baby was born sickly? Prudence brought that special milk pudding every day for a month. Child grew strong as an ox." Sheriff Aldrich tipped his hat to the couple and continued his evening patrol down the main road. The town seemed peaceful enough, a far cry from the chaos and crime he'd left behind in Richmond. Here, neighbors helped neighbors, and the biggest concerns were crop failures and harsh weather. The Whitmore sisters appeared to be the heart of this community spirit, beloved by all who knew them. He paused outside their cottage, noting the warm lamplight glowing in the windows and the delicious aroma drifting from their chimney. Even now, at this late hour, it seemed they were preparing another meal for someone in need. The thought brought a smile to his face. In a world filled with selfishness and cruelty, it was comforting to know that pure goodness still existed. But as Sheriff Aldrich walked away into the darkness, he failed to notice the high wooden fence that enclosed the sisters' backyard, or the fresh dirt mounded near the garden shed, or the way Prudence's silhouette moved back and forth past the kitchen window in a rhythm too methodical for ordinary cooking. Inside the cottage, Constance carefully recorded the day's events in her leather-bound journal. February 15, 1841. Ministered to the Henderson family. Little Mary responded well to the broth. The community continues to flourish under our care. She paused, her pen hovering over the page, then added in smaller script, "The new sheriff seems observant. We must be mindful." Prudence looked up from her work at the kitchen table, where she was carefully wrapping portions of meat in clean linen. "How long do you think we can continue, sister?" "As long as the Lord provides, dear Prudence. As long as there are those in need, and those who wander into our care." Constance closed the journal and locked it in the wooden box beside her bed. "Now, help me prepare tomorrow's deliveries. I believe the widow Morrison could use some of that nice roast we prepared." The two sisters worked in comfortable silence, their practiced hands dividing the tender meat into portions perfect for a town that had learned to depend on their endless generosity. Outside, the wind whistled through the bare trees, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the pale winter moon. In the morning, Millbrook would wake to another day of the Whitmore sisters' charity, never questioning the source of their abundance, never wondering why two spinster women who kept no livestock could provide such endless varieties of perfectly seasoned meat. The town had learned not to look too closely at gifts from heaven. But heaven, as Sheriff Aldrich would soon discover, sometimes had a very earthly, and very dark, address. Would you trust neighbors who seemed too generous, too perfect, especially when you couldn't explain where their endless charity came from? Sometimes the most beloved people in a community are hiding the darkest secrets of all. The March wind still carried winter's bite when Ezra Collins collapsed in his field, clutching his chest as his heart finally surrendered to a lifetime of hard labor. By the time his son found him among the muddy furrows, the old farmer had been dead for hours, his weathered face turned toward a sky that promised more hardship than hope. Within hours of the news spreading through Millbrook, Constance and Prudence Whitmore appeared at the Collins homestead, their arms laden with enough food to feed the growing crowd of mourners. The widow Collins, overwhelmed by grief and the sudden responsibility of burying her husband, could barely lift her head when the sisters entered her kitchen. "You don't need to worry about anything, Margaret," Constance said softly, immediately taking charge of the funeral preparations. "Prudence will handle the cooking, and I'll see to the arrangements with Reverend Hayes." Prudence moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, her skilled hands transforming the sisters' mysterious provisions into a feast that would feed half the town. The aroma that filled the house was rich and complex, roasted meat with herbs that no one could quite identify, gravies that seemed too flavorful for ordinary beef or pork, and stews that warmed the soul as much as the body. "Where do you suppose they get such fine meat?" whispered Mrs. Patterson to her neighbor as they watched Prudence carve perfect slices from a roast that looked more tender than anything their own livestock had ever produced. "Hush now," came the reply. "It's not our place to question the Lord's provision through such generous souls." Sheriff Aldrich arrived at the Collins home that evening to pay his respects, but found himself lingering in the crowded parlor, observing the dynamics of this tight-knit community. Every person present spoke of the Whitmore sisters with an almost reverent gratitude. They recounted stories of miraculous recoveries aided by Prudence's special broths, of families saved from starvation by the sisters' endless generosity, of children who had grown strong on milk and meat that appeared whenever it was needed most. "Those women are the backbone of this town," Reverend Hayes told the sheriff as they stepped outside for air. "I've been ministering here for 15 years, and I've never seen such consistent Christian charity. They ask for nothing in return, never seek recognition, just quietly serve wherever there's need." "It's remarkable," Aldrich agreed, though something nagged at the back of his mind. "Tell me, Reverend, have you ever visited their home? Seen their larder or smokehouse?" The Reverend looked puzzled by the question. "Well, no. They're very private about their domestic arrangements. I assumed they had family connections, perhaps relatives who supply them from larger farms to the east. That night, Sheriff Aldrich walked the perimeter of the Whitmore property, noting details he'd missed during his previous casual observations. The cottage itself was modest but well maintained, with curtained windows and a stone chimney that rarely seemed to stop smoking. But it was the backyard that drew his attention, completely enclosed by a fence nearly 8 feet high, with no gaps between the boards and a gate secured with a heavy iron lock. The next morning brought news that sent another wave of sorrow through Millbrook. Young Timothy Shaw, barely 16 years old, had been found dead in the woods, apparently killed by a falling tree during the previous night's windstorm. His parents were devastated, unable to afford a proper burial for their only son. Before the sun had reached its peak, the Whitmore sisters appeared at the Shaw cottage with everything needed for a funeral feast. Prudence carried pot after pot of the most aromatic stew anyone had ever smelled, while Constance brought fresh bread, preserved fruits, and cuts of meat so perfectly prepared they could have graced a wealthy man's table. "How do they do it?" Mrs. Shaw sobbed into Constance's shoulder. "How do they always know exactly what we need?" "The Lord works through willing hearts, dear," Constance replied, stroking the grieving mother's hair. "We are simply his instruments." But Sheriff Aldrich noticed something that others missed in their grief and gratitude. Timothy Shaw had been a large boy, well-muscled from farm work, and his body had been found with significant damage from the fallen tree. Yet when the local carpenter prepared the coffin, he mentioned to Aldrich that the boy seemed much lighter than expected, and strangely, some portions of the body appeared to be missing entirely, explained away as damage from forest scavengers. That same evening, as the Shaw family and their neighbors gathered to mourn, they feasted on meat so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork, flavored with spices that seemed to awaken something primal in those who tasted it. Men who hadn't had a proper meal in weeks found themselves taking second and third helpings, while women praised Prudence's cooking skills as nothing short of miraculous. "I've never tasted anything like this," confided Samuel Morrison to his wife as they walked home under the stars. "It's richer than any beef I've ever had, more satisfying than the finest pork. Those sisters truly have a gift." "A gift from God," his wife agreed, though she couldn't shake the strange dreams that followed every meal they shared at the Whitmore table, dreams filled with unfamiliar flavors and shadowy figures moving through moonlit kitchens. From his position near the Shaw cottage, Sheriff Aldrich watched the sisters pack up their empty pots and serving dishes with the same quiet efficiency they brought to everything else. Prudence wrapped the remaining portions of meat in clean linen, distributing them to families who would make them last for days. Constance spoke softly with the widow Shaw, promising continued support in the difficult days ahead. As the sisters walked home through the darkness, their silhouettes moving like benevolent spirits along the moonlit path, Aldrich found himself following at a distance. He told himself it was merely the protective instinct of a lawman ensuring the safety of two women walking alone at night, but truthfully, he was beginning to feel the first stirrings of something he couldn't quite name, a curiosity mixed with unease that grew stronger each time he witnessed their seemingly impossible generosity. The sisters reached their cottage and disappeared inside, but Aldrich lingered in the shadows, watching as lamplight moved from room to room. Just before he turned to leave, he heard something that made him freeze, the sound of heavy objects being dragged across wooden floors, followed by the distinct noise of a cellar door opening and closing. It was probably nothing, he told himself as he walked back toward town. Just two elderly women storing their supplies for the next day's charitable work. But the sound echoed in his mind long after he'd reached his own bed, mixing with memories of two tender meat and grateful faces that never asked where such abundance came from in a town where everyone else struggled to survive. The April rain drummed against the windows of the Millbrook General Store as Sheriff Aldrich reviewed the ledger that served as the town's unofficial registry of visitors. In a community as small and isolated as theirs, strangers were notable events, and most folks made it their business to know who was passing through and why. "That fur trapper, Jenkins, you said he came through about 3 weeks ago?" Aldrich asked the store owner, running his finger down the list of recent transactions. "I bought supplies for a week's journey north." Said he was heading to the territory beyond Harper's Ridge to check his trap lines. Marcus Webb scratched his graying beard. "Friendly fellow, paid in silver coin. Haven't seen him come back through, though." Aldrich made a note in his own journal. "And the peddler before him, what was his name?" "Caleb Morrison. No relation to our Samuel Morrison, mind you. This one was from down south, carried a wagon full of household goods and patent medicines. The Whitmore sisters bought quite a bit from him, as I recall." "When was that?" Webb consulted his records. "Early March, just after the Collins funeral. Spoke of staying in town a few days to repair his wagon wheel, but I never saw him leave. Assumed he headed out early one morning." That evening, Aldrich visited 3 more families who had interacted with recent strangers, and the pattern that emerged made his pulse quicken. Over the past 6 months, at least 7 travelers had passed through Millbrook, fur trappers, peddlers, circuit preachers, and laborers seeking work. All had been seen entering the town, several had been spotted near or visiting the Whitmore cottage, but none had been witnessed leaving. The explanations always came easily enough. Must have left before dawn. Probably took the north road. These traveling folk, they don't like goodbyes. But when Aldrich pressed for details, no one could provide specific sightings of any departure. What troubled him more was the timing. Each disappearance had been followed within days by an extraordinary feast provided by the Whitmore sisters, meals so abundant and varied that they seemed impossible for 2 women with no visible livestock or substantial garden to produce. "Sheriff, you seem troubled," Constance Whitmore observed when she encountered him on the street the following afternoon. Her smile was as warm as always, her manner genuinely concerned. "Is there some danger to our community we should know about?" "Nothing specific, Miss Whitmore. Just routine inquiries about travelers who've passed through recently. Part of my job to keep track of such things." "Of course. We've always felt so safe here in Millbrook, knowing we have such a dedicated protector." She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, we have had several visitors stop by our cottage in recent months. Poor souls seeking shelter or a warm meal. Prudence and I never turn anyone away." "That's very Christian of you. Do you recall any names?" "Oh, let me think. There was a fur trapper, Jenkins, I believe. Such a rough man, but hungry. We fed him well before he continued on his journey. And a medicine peddler, though I can't recall his name. He was particularly grateful for Prudence's cooking." Her eyes took on a distant, almost dreamy quality. "There have been others, too. A young man seeking farm work, an older fellow claiming to be a preacher, though he knew surprisingly little scripture." "Did any of them mention their destinations when they left?" Constance's expression grew slightly puzzled. "Well, they didn't exactly announce their departures, Sheriff. You know how these wandering types are, here one day, gone the next. We always assume they've moved on to wherever the road takes them." That night, Aldrich conducted his most thorough patrol yet, paying particular attention to the roads leading out of Millbrook. The muddy ground should have shown signs of wagon wheels or horse hooves if travelers had departed recently, but the paths were unmarked except for the tracks of townspeople going about their daily business. He found himself once again standing outside the high fence that surrounded the Whitmore backyard. In the darkness, he could hear sounds that seemed oddly industrious for the late hour, the scrape of shovels against earth, the thud of heavy objects being moved. When he pressed his ear to the fence, he caught fragments of whispered conversation between the sisters. "Deeper this time, Prudence. The spring rains will wash away. Should have been more careful with the bones. That piece of. Next time we'll use more lime. Can't have the smell." The words were too broken to make complete sense, but they sent a chill down Aldrich's spine. He eased away from the fence, careful not to make any noise that might alert the sisters to his presence. The next morning brought another stranger to Millbrook, a well-dressed merchant named Daniel Fletcher who claimed to be traveling from Richmond to the Western Territories. He set up temporary shop in the town square, displaying bolts of fine cloth and household luxuries that drew every woman in the community. "Sheriff Aldrich, isn't it?" Fletcher extended a manicured hand when they met. "I've heard wonderful things about your little town. The hospitality here is legendary, they tell me. Is that so? Where did you hear such things?" "Oh, travelers talk, you know. Word spreads along the trade routes about places where a man can find good food and honest dealing." Fletcher's eyes sparkled with commercial enthusiasm. "In fact, I've already been invited to dinner by two delightful ladies, the Misses Whitmore, I believe. Such gracious women." Aldrich felt his stomach drop. "When is this dinner planned?" "Tonight, actually. They insisted I shouldn't spend money on the inn when Christian hospitality was freely offered. I must say, their reputation for cooking is quite remarkable. Everyone I've spoken to mentions their exceptional meals. Mr. Fletcher, I wonder if I might suggest you reconsider that invitation." The merchant's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Whatever for? Have I given some offense?" Aldrich struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman. "It's just, there have been some unusual circumstances lately involving travelers who've had difficulty continuing their journeys after visiting certain homes." Fletcher laughed heartily. "Sheriff, you sound like you're describing some kind of trap for unwary merchants. I assure you, I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Besides, what harm could come from two elderly spinster sisters?" That evening, Aldrich positioned himself across the street from the Whitmore cottage, hidden in the shadows of an old oak tree. He watched Daniel Fletcher arrive at the front door carrying a bottle of wine and a small gift wrapped in brown paper. The sisters welcomed him with their customary warmth, and through the lighted windows, Aldrich could see them serving what appeared to be an elegant dinner. The merchant stayed late into the night, and Aldrich began to think his suspicions were nothing more than the paranoid imaginings of a city sheriff unused to small-town innocence. But as the hours passed and Fletcher showed no signs of leaving, Aldrich's unease grew. Finally, near midnight, he saw Prudence moving about the kitchen in a way that seemed strangely urgent. She carried several large pots to what must have been the cellar, then returned with items that gleamed metallic in the lamplight. When Constance joined her sister, both women moved with the practiced efficiency of people performing familiar tasks. By dawn, Daniel Fletcher's wagon still sat in front of the cottage, his horse still tied to the hitching post. But the merchant himself was nowhere to be seen. Aldrich waited until full daylight before approaching the cottage. He found Constance tending her front garden, humming softly as she worked the soil with a small hand spade. "Good morning, Sheriff. You're out early today. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Fletcher before he continued his journey. Is he still here?" Constance looked genuinely surprised. "Oh my, no. He left quite early, I'm afraid. Said he wanted to get a good start on the road to avoid the heat of the day. Such a considerate man. His wagon is still here." For just a moment, something flickered across Constance's face, so quickly that Aldrich almost missed it. Then her smile returned, bright as ever. "Is it? How odd. Perhaps he had business in town first and planned to collect it later. Or maybe he arranged to sell it to someone locally. You know how these merchants operate, Sheriff, always making deals and changing plans." But when Aldrich returned that afternoon, both the wagon and horse had vanished as completely as Daniel Fletcher himself. The sisters, when asked, could only suggest that the merchant must have concluded his business and departed for parts unknown. That night, the Whitmore cottage was filled with the most incredible aromas, and by evening, Constance was distributing portions of the finest roasted meat anyone in Millbrook had ever tasted to families throughout the town. The grateful recipients praised the sisters' continued generosity, never questioning how two women with no visible means could consistently provide such abundance. Sheriff Aldrich accepted his own portion with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, then quietly buried the perfectly seasoned meat in his backyard garden, unable to shake the feeling that Daniel Fletcher's final contribution to Millbrook had been far more personal than anyone imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sheriff Aldrich's desk as he spread out the papers that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. 7 names written in careful script, 7 strangers who had vanished from Millbrook without a trace. Beside each name, he had noted the date of disappearance and the remarkable feast that had followed within days of each incident. Jenkins, the fur trapper, disappeared March 8, followed by an elaborate dinner for the Patterson family's sick child. Caleb Morrison, the peddler, vanished March 12, after which the Whitmore sisters provided enough meat to feed the entire Collins funeral gathering. The pattern continued with disturbing consistency through Daniel Fletcher's disappearance just 3 days prior. A knock at his door interrupted Aldrich's brooding examination of the evidence. Reverend Hayes entered, his usually jovial face creased with concern. "Sheriff, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I've been hearing some peculiar talk around town. Folks are saying you've been asking strange questions about our visitors, expressing doubts about the Whitmore sisters' generosity. I wondered if perhaps you might share what's troubling you." Aldrich gestured to a chair. "Reverend, in your 15 years here, have you ever known the sisters to keep livestock? Cattle, pigs, chickens?" "Well, no. They've always been quite open about purchasing their provisions from elsewhere." Hayes paused, looking puzzled. "Why do you ask? And yet they consistently provide more fresh meat than the rest of the town combined. Meat of exceptional quality, varieties that none of our local farmers produce." Aldrich leaned forward. "Where do you suppose it comes from?" The Reverend's discomfort was visible. "Sheriff, I hope you're not suggesting something improper about 2 of the most charitable women I've ever known. Their generosity has kept this community alive through its darkest times." "I'm not questioning their generosity, Reverend. I'm questioning its source." That afternoon, Aldrich made a decision that would either confirm his suspicions or prove him a fool. He waited until both sisters left their cottage for their daily visit to the sick and needy, then approached their property from the rear, where the imposing fence blocked all view of their backyard activities. The lock on the gate was substantial, but Aldrich's years in Richmond had taught him certain skills that proved useful now. Within minutes, he was standing in the Whitmore sisters' private domain, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The backyard was larger than it appeared from outside, extending back into a grove of trees that provided perfect concealment from neighboring properties. But it was the ground itself that told the story Aldrich had dreaded to discover. The entire area was crisscrossed with patches of recently disturbed earth, some fresh, others partially settled. The smell of lime hung heavy in the air, and he could see bags of the white powder stacked near a tool shed. Near the back of the property stood a second building, smaller than the main cottage but substantial enough to serve a specific purpose. The door was secured with another heavy lock, but the windows, though covered with thick curtains, showed gaps where lamplight had once leaked through. Aldrich worked quickly to open this lock as well, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. The door swung open to reveal a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The interior had been converted into what could only be described as a butcher shop, but one designed for creatures larger than any farm animal. Heavy hooks hung from reinforced ceiling beams, and the floor sloped toward a central drain that disappeared into darkness. Tables lined the walls, their surfaces scarred by countless knife cuts and stained with substances that hadn't been entirely scrubbed away despite obvious efforts at cleanliness. Along one wall stood shelves filled with glass jars containing what appeared to be preserved organs and other body parts suspended in cloudy liquid. A large ledger lay open on one of the tables, its pages covered with dates, names, and notations that made Aldrich's stomach lurch. March 8, Jenkins, good marbling, excellent for roasts. Shoulders particularly tender. March 12, Morrison, tough meat, required long cooking. Suitable for stews only. April 15, Fletcher, prime quality throughout. Saved best cuts for Sunday dinner at Henderson's. Each entry contained detailed notes about preparation methods, cooking times, and which families had received portions of the processed remains. The clinical precision of the records was somehow more horrifying than the acts they documented. Aldrich forced himself to continue reading, finding entries that stretched back over 2 years. Men, women, even children, all reduced to entries in a butcher's ledger, their lives measured only by the quality of meat they provided and the families who had unknowingly consumed them. The sound of voices approaching from the front of the cottage sent Aldrich into panicked motion. He closed the ledger, secured the building, and slipped back through the gate just as he heard the sisters' familiar voices discussing their afternoon visits. That evening, he sat in his office staring at notes he'd made from memory, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Whitmore sisters weren't just murderers, they were systematic cannibals who had turned their crimes into a form of community service, feeding their victims to the very people they claimed to help. The worst part was the gratitude. Every family in Millbrook had accepted the sisters' generosity, praised their cooking, begged for their recipes. Children had grown strong on human flesh, the sick had recovered with the aid of broths made from their neighbors, and the entire community had survived their hardships by consuming the bodies of strangers who had sought nothing more than shelter and a warm meal. A soft knock interrupted his horrified reverie. Constance Whitmore stood in his doorway, carrying a covered dish that filled the room with rich, savory aromas. "Sheriff Aldrich, you looked so tired during your patrol today. Prudence and I thought you might enjoy some of our special stew." Her smile was warm and motherly as she set the dish on his desk. "We used the last of that wonderful meat we acquired recently. I do hope you'll find it nourishing." Aldrich stared at the covered dish, knowing with absolute certainty what it contained. "That's very thoughtful of you, Miss Whitmore. Tell me, what type of meat did you use?" "Oh, it's our own special recipe. The secret is in the slow preparation and careful seasoning. We've been perfecting it for years." Her eyes held a strange gleam in the lamplight. "I do hope you'll try it while it's still warm. There's nothing quite like it when it's fresh." After she left, Aldrich sat motionless for nearly an hour, staring at the dish that contained the remains of Daniel Fletcher. The merchant who had laughed at the sheriff's warnings, who had trusted in the kindness of 2 elderly women, who had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Finally, Aldrich carried the stew outside and emptied it into the alley behind his office, then spent the rest of the night planning how to expose horrors that no one in Millbrook would want to believe. But first, he had to decide whether to try to save the next victim, or use him as bait to catch the sisters in the act. The choice would test not only his courage, but his willingness to sacrifice one life to save countless others. Because as certain as he was about the sisters' crimes, he was equally certain that no one in Millbrook would believe him without irrefutable proof, and obtaining that proof might require watching another human being die. The humid air of late May clung to Sheriff Aldrich's skin as he adjusted the worn leather vest that concealed his badge and gun. In the cracked mirror of the abandoned cabin 5 miles outside Millbrook, he studied his reflection. 3 days without shaving had given him the rough appearance of a traveling laborer, and the old clothes he'd borrowed from evidence storage completed the deception. He had spent 2 weeks planning this moment, wrestling with the moral implications of what he was about to do. Every day of delay meant another potential victim might wander into the sisters' trap, but rushing in without proof would only result in his own discreditation and their continued freedom to kill. The plan was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. He would pose as a drifter seeking work and shelter, accept the sisters' inevitable invitation to dinner, and somehow document their methods without becoming their next victim. The tiny vial of syrup of ipecac hidden in his boot would help him simulate the effects of whatever drug they used, while the pepper extract in his pocket might serve as a weapon if all else failed. As evening shadows lengthened across the countryside, Aldrich began his approach to Millbrook from the east, adopting the weary gait of a man who had walked many miles. He paused at the general store just as Marcus Webb was preparing to close. "Evenin', friend. You wouldn't know of any work hereabouts, would you? I can turn my hand to most anything, farming, carpentry, loading wagons." Webb studied the disheveled stranger with the mixture of curiosity and caution that all small towns reserve for newcomers. "Times are hard around here, mister. Most folks can barely feed their own families, let alone hire help. You might try the Hendersons, they've been talking about clearing that back field, but I don't know if they've got cash money to pay wages." "Obliged for the suggestion. I don't suppose there's a boarding house in town?" "I've got a little money saved. Mrs. Patterson takes in travelers sometimes, but her place is full up with her sister's family visiting. Your best bet might be to ask around, folks here are generally helpful to those in need." As if summoned by Webb's words, Constance Whitmore appeared in the store's doorway, her marketing basket on her arm and her eyes immediately focusing on the stranger with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Oh my, you look absolutely exhausted, young man. Have you traveled far?" Aldrich removed his hat respectfully. "Yes, ma'am. Down from Pennsylvania, looking for work and a place to rest. The gentleman here was just telling me accommodation might be scarce." "Nonsense." Constance's voice carried the warmth that had made her beloved throughout Millbrook. "My sister and I would be happy to offer you supper and a place to sleep tonight. We have a small cottage, nothing fancy, but clean and comfortable." "That's very kind of you, ma'am, but I wouldn't want to impose on two ladies living alone." "Oh, we've housed many travelers over the years. It's our Christian duty, and frankly, we enjoy the company. I'm Constance Whitmore, and my sister is Prudence. We live just down the main road, the cottage with the white picket fence and rose bushes." Webb nodded approvingly. "You couldn't ask for better hosts, friend. The Whitmore sisters are known throughout the county for their hospitality." An hour later, Aldrich found himself seated in the sisters' cozy parlor, a cup of tea warming his hands while the incredible aromas of Prudence's cooking filled the air. The cottage was exactly as he had imagined, spotlessly clean, tastefully furnished, and radiating the kind of domestic tranquility that made the horrors he knew lurked nearby seem impossible. "You must tell us about your travels," Constance said, settling into her rocking chair with her own cup of tea. "We so rarely hear news from the wider world." Aldrich had prepared a detailed backstory about losing his farm to creditors and seeking a fresh start in the Western Territories. As he spoke, he carefully observed both sisters, noting how Prudence remained silent in the kitchen while Constance handled all conversation. The tea had a slightly sweet taste that he couldn't identify, along with an underlying bitterness that might have been unfamiliar herbs. "Such hardships you've endured," Constance murmured sympathetically. "Well, you'll have a good meal and a proper night's rest before continuing your journey. Prudence is preparing something special. She has such a gift for cooking that people come from miles around just to taste her creations." The meal that followed was unlike anything Aldrich had ever experienced. The meat was incredibly tender, falling apart at the touch of his fork, with a rich, complex flavor that seemed to awaken every taste bud. The vegetables were perfectly prepared, but it was the meat that dominated the meal, course after course of preparations that ranged from delicate to robust, each more delicious than the last. "This is extraordinary," Aldrich said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice while fighting the nausea that came from knowing what he was eating. "What kind of meat is this? I've never tasted anything quite like it." Prudence glanced at her sister before answering, her voice soft and musical. "It's a special cut we acquire from selective sources. The secret is in the preparation, long, slow cooking with herbs that have been in our family for generations. Our grandmother taught us that the finest meals come from understanding your ingredients completely, Constance added, her eyes never leaving Aldrich's face. Knowing where they come from, how they lived, what they experienced. It all affects the final result. As the evening progressed, Aldrich began to feel the effects of whatever substance had been added to his tea. His limbs grew heavy, his thoughts sluggish, and the room seemed to drift in and out of focus. This was the moment he had prepared for. He allowed his eyelids to flutter and his speech to slur, while secretly dosing himself with the ipecac that would help simulate unconsciousness. "Oh dear," Constance said, rising from her chair with practiced concern. "You must be more exhausted than we realized. Here, let us help you to the guest room." But instead of being led to a bedroom, Aldrich found himself being guided toward the back of the house, through a door he hadn't noticed before. The sisters supported him with surprising strength, their hands steady and sure as they navigated a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. The cellar was cool and damp, lit by several oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. But it was the contents of the room that confirmed Aldrich's worst fears. Heavy chains hung from the ceiling beams, and a large wooden table dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred by countless knife cuts and stained dark with substances that gleamed wetly in the lamplight. "Such a fine specimen," Prudence murmured, speaking more than she had all evening. "Good muscle tone, not too much fat. He'll provide excellent cuts." Indeed, Constance agreed, beginning to remove items from a cabinet that lined one wall. "The shoulders look particularly promising. And we haven't had liver this fresh in weeks." Aldrich forced himself to remain limp as they positioned him on the table, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to leap up and run. This was the moment that would either provide the evidence needed to convict them or result in his own death, and he had to trust in his plan despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. "Should we begin with the bleeding?" Prudence asked, selecting a long, thin knife from an array of blades that hung on the wall. "Not yet, sister. Let's make sure he's completely unconscious first. We don't want him thrashing about like that last one." Constance leaned over Aldrich, checking his pulse and lifting his eyelids to examine his pupils. For a horrifying moment, he thought she had detected his deception, but then she nodded with satisfaction. "He's ready. Begin with the major vessels. We want to preserve as much of the meat as possible." This was the moment. Aldrich's hand found the pepper extract in his pocket as Prudence raised the knife above his throat. In one explosive movement, he sat up and threw the caustic liquid directly into both sisters' faces, then rolled off the table as they screamed and clutched at their burning eyes. "Sheriff's office," he shouted, drawing his concealed weapon as the sisters stumbled blindly around the cellar. "You're both under arrest for murder." Constance, despite her pain, managed to reach another knife from the wall. "You don't understand," she gasped, tears streaming down her chemical-burned cheeks. "We were helping them. Giving their deaths meaning. Feeding the hungry. By butchering innocent people like animals. They were strangers." Prudence shrieked, still clawing at her eyes. "Worthless wanderers with no families, no purpose. We gave them purpose. We made them part of something beautiful." Aldrich backed toward the stairs, keeping his gun trained on both women. "How many? How many people have you killed?" "Not killed," Constance corrected, her voice taking on an almost religious fervor despite her obvious agony. "Transformed. Elevated. Made sacred through our work." The sisters began moving toward him with a coordination that spoke of years of partnership in unspeakable acts. Even partially blinded, they seemed to know exactly where he was, their movements predatory and purposeful. "The whole town," Prudence whispered, her burned face twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Everyone you've sworn to protect. They've all tasted our gifts. They're all part of it now. Aldrich's retreat up the stairs became a desperate scramble as the sisters pursued him, their earlier pretense of genteel hospitality completely abandoned. Behind him, he could hear Constance's voice rising in what sounded almost like song. "You can't save them now, Sheriff. They've developed such refined tastes. When they learn what they've been eating, what do you think they'll choose? The truth, or another helping of our special stew?" He burst through the cellar door into the cottage's main room, then straight out the front entrance into the humid night air. Behind him, the sisters' laughter followed like the sound of breaking glass, filled with a madness that spoke of years spent crossing lines that should never be crossed. But as Aldrich ran through the darkened streets of Millbrook toward his office, he realized that exposing the sisters was only the beginning of his nightmare. Every family in town had eaten their food, trusted their generosity, become unknowing participants in acts of cannibalism that had sustained them through their darkest times. The real horror wouldn't be in arresting two elderly women. It would be in telling an entire community that their survival had been built on the bodies of the dead, and watching them decide whether they could live with that knowledge, or whether they would choose to silence the messenger who brought such unbearable truth. If this was your brother, would you still forgive him, or lock the door behind you? Sometimes the most terrifying choice isn't between good and evil, but between a comfortable lie and a truth that destroys everything you thought you knew about the people you love. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through the windows of the sheriff's office when Aldrich finished writing his report, his hands still trembling from the night's revelations. Every detail had to be recorded, the cellar chamber, the butcher's ledger, the sisters' confessions, before the enormity of what he discovered could be dismissed as the ravings of a man pushed beyond his limits. A soft knock at the door made him reach instinctively for his gun, but the voice that called out belonged to Reverend Hayes. "Sheriff? I saw your lamp burning all night. Is everything all right?" Aldrich opened the door to find not only the Reverend, but Marcus Webb from the general store and Samuel Morrison, all three men wearing expressions of concern mixed with curiosity. "We heard some commotion near the Whitmore cottage last night," Webb explained. "Saw you running through town like the devil himself was chasing you. What's happened?" The moment Aldrich had been dreading was upon him. He gestured for the men to enter, then closed the door and turned the lock. What he was about to tell them would either rally the community to justice or turn them against him as a madman who had attacked their most beloved citizens. "Gentlemen, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but every word is the truth." For the next hour, Aldrich laid out the evidence methodically, the pattern of disappearing strangers, the impossible abundance of the sisters' generosity, the discovery of the cellar chamber and its horrific contents. He read directly from his notes, describing the butcher's implements, the ledger entries, and finally his own near-death experience in their underground lair. The three men listened in stunned silence, their faces cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally a sick recognition as pieces of a puzzle they'd never wanted to solve began clicking into place. "Dear God," Reverend Hayes whispered, his face pale as parchment. "The meals, we've all eaten their meals. Every family in town," Morrison added, his voice hollow. "My children, my wife, we praised that meat. Said it was the finest we'd ever tasted." Webb was staring at his hands as if he could still see blood on them. "That medicine peddler, Morrison, the one with the same name as you, Samuel. I sold him supplies for a week's journey. He was heading to your place that very afternoon to see if you might be relatives." "My God," Morrison breathed. "We wondered why Constance brought us that special roast the next day. Said it was to celebrate potential family connections." The weight of realization settled over them like a physical thing. Not only had they unknowingly consumed human flesh, but they had done so with gratitude, with praise for the sisters' culinary skills, with requests for second helpings and recipe secrets. "What do we do now?" Hayes asked, though his voice suggested he already dreaded the answer. "We gather the town council and present the evidence. Then we arrest Constance and Prudence Whitmore for multiple counts of murder. Aldrich's voice was steady, but his eyes reflected the same horror he saw in theirs. After that, we figure out how to tell 43 families that their survival has been built on the bones of the dead. By noon, every adult in Millbrook had crowded into the church, summoned by urgent word that Sheriff Aldrich had uncovered a threat to the community. The sisters were notably absent, having barricaded themselves in their cottage after the previous night's confrontation. Several men stood guard outside their home, though whether to prevent escape or protect them from mob justice remained unclear. Aldrich stood before the assembled crowd, still bearing the scratches and bruises from his ordeal in the cellar. Behind him on a table lay the evidence he'd managed to retrieve, pages torn from the sisters' ledger, tools from their makeshift butcher shop, and jars containing preserved remains that made several people in the front row turn away in revulsion. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "What I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you believe about charity, community, and the people we trust most." He began with the disappearing strangers, presenting the timeline he'd so carefully constructed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people recognized the names and remembered the feasts that had followed each vanishing. "That trapper Jenkins," called out Mrs. Patterson. "He stopped at our house asking for directions to the Whitmore cottage. Said someone in town had recommended their hospitality." "The peddler too," added another voice. "My daughter saw him unhitching his horse in their front yard. We thought nothing of it at the time." As Aldrich continued his presentation, describing the cellar chamber and reading selected entries from the sisters' ledger, the mood in the church shifted from confusion to horror to a kind of collective nausea that had nothing to do with physical illness. "You're saying," Martha Henderson's voice rose above the murmurs, "that when my little Mary was sick, and Constance brought that broth that saved her life." "I'm saying that broth was made from human remains, Mrs. Henderson. As was every meal the sisters provided to this community over the past 2 years." The explosion of voices that followed was deafening: denials, accusations, demands for proof, and underneath it all, the sound of people retching as the full implications hit them. Families who had celebrated the sisters' generosity, children who had grown strong on their mysterious meat, invalids who had recovered their health through carefully prepared broths, all of them now faced the knowledge that their survival had come at an unspeakable cost. "This is madness," shouted Abraham Crawford, rising from his pew. "The Whitmore sisters are godly women who've served this community for decades. I won't listen to these lies." But his wife was staring at her hands, remembering. "Abraham, that stew they brought when your back was injured. You said it was the most nourishing thing you'd ever tasted. Made you feel stronger than you had in years. Because it was good food prepared with love and care." "No," Sheriff Aldrich said quietly, his voice somehow carrying over the chaos. "Because it was human flesh, Mr. Crawford. Rich in nutrients that gave your body exactly what it needed to heal. The sisters weren't just murderers, they were efficient ones. They understood exactly how to use every part of their victims to maximum benefit." The church fell silent except for the sound of quiet weeping from several women and the harsh breathing of men trying to control their rage and revulsion. Reverend Hayes stood slowly, his face gray with shock and guilt. "Sheriff, what you're describing, it means we're all complicit. Every person in this room has participated in acts of cannibalism. We've praised the taste of human flesh, begged for recipes, fed it to our children. You were victims too, Reverend. Unknowing victims of 2 women who used your trust and desperation against you. But we enjoyed it," whispered Mary Patterson, tears streaming down her cheeks. "God help us, we enjoyed every bite." The discussion that followed was unlike anything in Millbrook's history. Some demanded immediate vigilante justice, wanting to storm the Whitmore cottage and exact brutal revenge. Others insisted on following proper legal procedures, despite the horror of what had been revealed. A few suggested that the sisters' crimes should be handled quietly, to protect the community from outside judgment and the survivors from the knowledge of what they'd consumed. It was young Timothy Shaw, the same boy whose death had provided meat for his own funeral feast, who asked the question that silenced every other debate. "Sheriff, if we let this be covered up, if we pretend it never happened, what's to stop someone else from doing the same thing? How do we know there aren't others like them in other towns, feeding neighbors to neighbors and calling it charity?" The boy's words crystallized the horrible truth that everyone had been avoiding. The Whitmore sisters weren't unique monsters, they were a symptom of something larger, a willingness to ignore uncomfortable questions as long as the benefits continued flowing. "We tell the truth," Aldrich said finally. "All of it. We arrest Constance and Prudence Whitmore, we hold a proper trial, and we let the world know what happened here. Because the only thing worse than learning you've been living a lie is continuing to live it after you know better." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone expected. 23 families voted to pursue full justice and public exposure. 20 families voted for quiet disposal of the problem. But it was enough. As the sun set on what would be remembered as the darkest day in Millbrook's history, Sheriff Aldrich prepared to lead a group of armed men to the Whitmore cottage. Behind them, the community they'd sworn to protect was already beginning to fracture, some families packing their belongings to flee the contaminated town, others gathering in small groups to debate whether their children could ever recover from the knowledge of what they'd unknowingly consumed. The sisters were waiting for them, dressed in their finest clothes and holding hands like children facing punishment for a broken vase. They came quietly, offering no resistance, their faces serene with the satisfaction of people who had lived according to their own moral code, regardless of what others might think. As the cell door closed behind them, Constance Whitmore looked directly at Sheriff Aldrich and smiled. "You think you've won something, Sheriff. But ask yourself this, in 6 months, when the town is starving again and there's no one to help, when children are crying from hunger and the old folks are dying from malnutrition, will your precious truth still seem so important? We fed this community. We kept it alive. What will you do to replace what we provided?" It was a question that would haunt Aldrich long after the sisters' trial and execution, long after Millbrook itself began to crumble and die as families fled the scene of such horror. Because in the end, the most terrifying truth wasn't that 2 women had turned murder into a sacrament of charity. It was that they had been so very good at it. 3 months after the trial that had captivated newspapers from Richmond to Boston, Millbrook was dying. Not from disease or natural disaster, but from the slow poison of knowledge that no community could digest and survive. Sheriff Aldrich walked the nearly empty main street in the gray light of an October morning, his footsteps echoing hollowly between abandoned buildings. Of the 43 families that had once called Millbrook home, fewer than a dozen remained. The rest had scattered like leaves before a storm, carrying with them secrets that would fester in new communities hundreds of miles away. The Whitmore cottage stood empty, its windows boarded and its infamous backyard scraped bare by investigators seeking evidence of additional victims. The official count had reached 31 confirmed deaths, spanning nearly 3 years of methodical murder and consumption. But the true devastation couldn't be measured in numbers. Martha Henderson emerged from the general store, one of the few businesses still struggling to remain open. Her daughter Mary, the child whose life had supposedly been saved by Constance's special broth, had not spoken a word since learning the truth about her recovery. The girl spent her days staring out windows, refusing all food except water and plain bread. "Any word from Richmond about the supply wagon?" Henderson asked, though they both knew the answer. No merchant wanted to trade with the town where the Cannibal sisters had operated. The stain of association was too strong, the fear of contamination too real. "Nothing yet," Aldrich replied. "But I'll keep trying." The lie came easily now. He'd stopped trying weeks ago, when the last merchant had flatly refused to enter Millbrook's boundaries. The town's reputation had spread beyond Virginia, becoming a cautionary tale told in taverns and marketplaces throughout the eastern states. The place where neighbors fed on neighbors. The community that had thrived on human flesh. Later that day, Aldrich made his weekly visit to the families who remained, checking on their welfare and trying to hold together the fragments of what had once been a thriving community. Each visit was harder than the last. The Morrison family had barricaded themselves inside their cabin, convinced that the contamination of cannibalism might be contagious. Samuel refused to let his children play with others who had consumed the sisters' meals, creating divisions within divisions in an already fractured population. The Pattersons had developed an obsessive ritual of purification, bathing multiple times daily and burning any clothing they'd worn during the sisters' reign of terror. Mrs. Patterson spent hours each day scrubbing her hands raw, trying to cleanse herself of imagined residue from meals she'd praised and savored. But it was the Crawford family that illustrated the deepest horror of Millbrook's transformation. Abraham had begun supplementing their dwindling food supplies by hunting in the woods where some of the sisters' victims had originally disappeared. His wife watched him prepare their meals with a mixture of terror and fascination, unable to shake the memory of how satisfying truly fresh meat could be. "It's different," she confided to Aldrich during one of his visits, her voice barely above a whisper. "The deer, the rabbit, it all tastes flat now. Empty. After what we've experienced, ordinary meat seems like eating sawdust." This was the nightmare that Constance Whitmore had predicted from her cell before the execution. Not just the knowledge of what they'd consumed, but the preference they'd developed for it. The sisters hadn't just fed Millbrook's bodies, they'd educated their palates, creating tastes that could never be satisfied by conventional means. 3 families had already crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. The Hendersons had been discovered with the partially butchered remains of a vagrant who'd sought shelter. The Shaws had been found with suspicious cuts of meat that bore no resemblance to any local game. Each time, the explanations grew thinner, the community's willingness to ignore evidence more strained. Aldrich sat in his office that evening, staring at reports he could never file, describing crimes he could never prosecute. How do you arrest an entire community for developing unnatural appetites? How do you prosecute people for craving what they'd been systematically trained to enjoy? A knock at his door brought him back to the present. Reverend Hayes entered, but the man who had once radiated Christian certainty now moved like someone carrying an invisible weight. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you about something." Hayes closed the door behind him and took a seat, his hands trembling slightly. "I've been having dreams. Terrible dreams about the meals we shared. But they're not nightmares, Thomas. They're beautiful dreams. Dreams where the meat is perfectly prepared, seasoned with care, and I'm grateful for every bite. Reverend. I wake up disappointed. Disappointed that it was only a dream." Hayes buried his face in his hands. "What kind of man does that make me? What kind of Christian finds himself missing the taste of human flesh?" It was the conversation Aldrich had been dreading, but knew was inevitable. The physical addiction to cannibalism was well documented in medical literature, but the psychological dependency was less understood and infinitely more dangerous. "You're not alone in this," Aldrich admitted. "Half the remaining families have confided similar feelings to me. The sisters didn't just feed you, they changed you at a fundamental level. Then what do we do? How do we live with these appetites?" Before Aldrich could answer, another knock interrupted them. Mary Patterson stood in the doorway, her young face bearing an expression far too old for her years. "Sheriff, you need to come quickly. There's been another incident." They found the Wheeler family gathered around their dinner table, plates empty but faces showing the telltale satisfaction that had become all too familiar. In their kitchen, carefully wrapped in butcher paper, were cuts of meat that could not possibly have come from any animal. "Where?" Aldrich asked quietly. John Wheeler met his gaze without shame. "The old cemetery. Some of the graves aren't as deep as they should be, especially after the rains we've had. Nature provides, Sheriff. Just like the sisters always said. It was the final corruption, the moment when Millbrook crossed from victim to perpetrator. The community that had been fed on murder was now feeding on the dead, rationalizing desecration as a form of resource management. That night, Sheriff Aldrich wrote his final report as a law officer, documenting the complete moral collapse of the town he'd sworn to protect. In the morning, he would join the exodus of families fleeing Millbrook, abandoning it to the few residents who had chosen adaptation over evacuation. But as he prepared to leave, he couldn't escape the weight of Constance Whitmore's final prediction. The surviving families would scatter across Virginia and beyond, carrying with them appetites that conventional society could never satisfy. Some would resist, finding ways to suppress their altered tastes. Others would seek new communities where they could quietly indulge their cravings. And perhaps, in some distant town where charity was needed and questions weren't asked, new benefactors would emerge. People who understood exactly how to prepare the most nourishing meals, how to help communities survive their darkest times, how to turn murder into a sacrament of care. The Whitmore sisters were dead, but their legacy was walking out of Millbrook in the bodies and minds of everyone they'd fed. The town that had eaten its visitors was now ready to feed that hunger to the wider world. Aldrich's last act as sheriff was to burn his office, along with all records of what had happened in Millbrook. Some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, some truths too corrupting to document. But as the flames consumed his carefully maintained files, he wondered if he was destroying evidence of past crimes or preventing documentation of future ones. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from other buildings as the remaining families burned their own traces of contamination. By morning, Millbrook would exist only in the memories of its survivors, and in the altered appetites they carried like a contagion into an unsuspecting world. The most terrifying monsters, Aldrich realized as he watched his hometown disappear into flame and shadow, weren't the ones who committed unspeakable acts. They were the ones who made those acts seem reasonable, necessary, even generous. They were the neighbors who taught you to enjoy what should have horrified you, and sent you into the world hungry for more. If this story stayed with you, if it made you question what you'd accept in desperate times and what you'd do to survive, comment, the meat was always too good. Because sometimes the most dangerous appetite is the one that feels like gratitude, and the hungriest monsters are the ones who call themselves your saviors.